Welcome to the IISS for this speech on Russia and presidential election challenges and opportunities for Europe. Vladimir Putin obliged us by declaring his candidacy last week, so we now have plenty to talk about. The invitation, which was put in rather more conditional terms. This is a year in some ways that has been one of on hold or waiting in Russia, waiting for the presidential election, also waiting for Donald Trump, although that didn't quite work out. But now we have the prospect of an election next year, and then what happens thereafter. And because there are a great many of questions open, we thought it'd be an excellent opportunity to bring Dr. Samuel Greene in to talk about these. Sam is head of the Russia Center at King's, just over the road. Before that, I met him first, I think, in 2010 at Moscow at the Carnegie Center when he was there as deputy director, and he was also at the New Economic School. So a long-time observer and resident of Russia, and someone who makes good use of his multi-entry visa as well. So he'll speak for about 20 minutes, 30 minutes. We're on the record, and then we'll have the rest of the time for Q&A. And with that, over to you, Sam.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you to IISS for the opportunity to have this conversation. I'll throw some thoughts out about where I think things are likely to go in the aftermath of the election. The election itself is probably less interesting to talk about. I don't think there's anybody in the room who was surprised that Putin decided to announce his candidacy last week. I think most of us will be very, very surprised if Ksenia Sobchak is duly elected president of Russia in March. Right. So clearly, the strong expectation is that Putin will be re-elected. He'll have another 6-year term. Inaugurated, I suppose, sometime in April or May. My conjecture, though, is that Putin's re-election, unlike most other re-elections around the world, will result in an almost immediate reduction of his ability to govern the country in a meaningful sense, right? Maintaining the status quo, yes, we'll get to that. But in terms of anything that would look like reform or development, right? So, given the constitutional limitation of the president to 2 consecutive terms, right, Putin's 4th inauguration launches the country into immediate speculation and, of course, backroom competition over who succeeds him in 2024, assuming that he does decide to serve out the full 6 years of his term. And again, there's nothing in available history to suggest that he wouldn't do so. We would see something that would look a lot like what we began to see after his 2nd inauguration in 2004. Right, given that the real power of the Russian presidency, and particularly this president, rests not only in the formal authority of his office, which of course is significant, but in his informal ability to arbitrate conflicts, primarily over the allocation and redistribution and availability of sources of rents to players in the political and economic and security elite. Right, the uncertainties that the question of succession create for Putin have the potential really to be much more debilitating. To be particularly debilitating. The political and economic elite will be on the lookout not simply for minor changes in the policy environment, which of course they're always looking at, but for radical shifts in the distribution of particularly economic power for the elite themselves. Right. The incentive for Putin then is to prevent the emergence of coalitions, right, that could try to bind his hand and force him into creating a particular reality, a particular outcome from 2024 onward, right? And so any forward information that he provides, right, about who will succeed him immediately creates mobilizing competing camps seeking either to position themselves for benefit in how they interpret that scenario, or if that looks to be impossible, to push Putin into changing his mind. Right. So even if a successor is not named outright, and again, what we remember from the last time around is that he waited really until the last possible moment to tell us that Dmitry Medvedev would succeed him. Right? Any significant policy or political shift, including the appointment of a new prime minister to replace Medvedev, as many are speculating, would be interpreted as a strong signal about 2024, again provoking elite mobilization both for and against the presumed outcome. Right? So in order for Putin to keep the elite focused on him rather than on their own strategies, any signals sent in one direction will need to be balanced by equally credible signals sent in the opposite direction. So the appointment of members of one camp, and we know that there are competing visions about economic reform and policy within and around the government, the appointment of members of one camp to important posts in the government, even in the central bank, will need to be offset by the appointment of their opponents to positions of equivalent power. Right? So the expectation, I think, is not just that the Kremlin maintains strategic ambiguity about the succession, but that, in fact, it avoids meaningful structural reform as such. Not, I think, out of a sense that structural reform is a bad thing, but out of an incapability of actually pursuing it in a way that would not destabilize politics. In this context, I think observers should probably expect the Kremlin to maintain its current forward policy stance for the foreseeable future, for at least two reasons. First, the presidential administration, the political team around Putin, have come to understand geopolitical confrontation, including both war, particularly in Ukraine, but also sanctions and confrontation with the West, as an important contributing factor to the stability and the public legitimacy of Putin as president. Right? Historically, Putin's political teams, right, they've changed the personnel over the last 17 years or so, but they have always pursued an approach to politics that could probably be summed up by the maxim, if it's not broke, don't fix it. Right? So they tend to be risk averse. They only engage in large-scale experiments with public opinion when prior approaches have demonstrably lost their value. So, for example, after the 2011-2012 protests, you saw a turn towards the introduction of identity and ideology in Russian politics in a way that hadn't been there before. Right? So the rally around the flag that boosted Putin's public support after the annexation of Crimea and the intervention in Donbass remains broadly robust. There are questions about exactly how robust, but I think it's still sufficiently robust that the Kremlin will not want to undermine it, even after the elections. Right? The Kremlin, of course, is well aware that Russia is not a classical electoral democracy, and thus legitimacy has to be maintained even between electoral cycles. It's not simply enough to say, right, we've won the election and we're good to go until 6 years from now or 4 years before the next parliamentary election. The second reason to expect foreign policy continuity relates to the Kremlin's relationship with the elite. Right? If the first was more about the relationship with the broad electorate. Right? We are told on good authority that many within the elite are growing increasingly frustrated with the limitations that geopolitical conflict, sanctions in particular, impose on their ability to make and enjoy their wealth, as well as with the government's inability to pursue significant structural reform and create more growth in the economy, and thus re-energize the rent flows on which they depend. Putin's public support, of course, at somewhere between 80-85%, right, makes him much more difficult to challenge, particularly if that challenge comes from within an elite that the vast majority of the Russian population see as corrupt and certainly something less than patriotic. Right, so people are aware of apartments in Miami, apartments in London, and business interests that extend beyond Russia's borders. But more importantly, I think sanctions, and this has been talked about, but particularly the financial sanctions bind the elite to the Kremlin in ways that were not present when there was a freer flow of liquidity from the West. So the fact that most major corporations and all regional governments have to channel their capital requirements either through the Ministry of Finance or through the Russian Central Bank gives the Kremlin leverage that it has never had before in the post-Soviet period over the political and economic elite. There is very little reason for Putin to want to give that leverage up. Benefits, of course, have costs associated with them, right? The economy, after 2 years of fairly deep recession, has returned to growth, looking at something, the headline figure is something in the range of 2% of GDP. Underlying that, however, the growth looks to be somewhat anemic and certainly uncertain, right? So we're seeing growing burden of household, corporate, and sub-sovereign government debt. Even as capital investment, consumption, and disposable incomes remain broadly flat across the economy, suggesting that the cost of just standing still, of maintaining the current rate of economic production, is becoming increasingly difficult to bear. Right? The federal government's fiscal position remains very strong. Right? Deficits about 1.5% of GDP. By global standards, that's spectacular. The overall sovereign debt burden is low at about 17 to 18% of GDP. Right? The sovereign wealth funds are diminishing, but they're there. Even when they're gone, the state can afford to borrow, but the risks to macroeconomic and fiscal stability obviously are growing. And the tools available to the government to maintain stability are gradually diminishing. And so, of course, Moscow will want to restore access to cost-effective sources of liquidity, which means ideally reopening broad access to European capital markets. The idea that they would be able to borrow at the length and at the cost from, say, China, that they have been habitually able to borrow in Europe, obviously hasn't panned out and looks unlikely to do so in the foreseeable future. Right? So within a reasonable amount of time after March 2018, the Kremlin is likely to seek a pathway, if not to lifting, then at least to limiting the impact of financial sanctions. Right? But given what I've already said about the importance of these sanctions, both for domestic politics and frankly, the entrenchment of pro-sanction sentiment in Western policy establishments, I think the Kremlin is unlikely to see full normalization over Ukraine and with Europe and the United States as plausible or indeed desirable. Right? The Kremlin, I think, will press for a less expansive interpretation of the sanctions, for relaxation of the pressure that particularly the U.S. Treasury exerts on banks and investors' compliance departments, so that at least some major Russian borrowers can return to the market. And in that context, I think we should expect to see Russia come forward with a proposal for a more robust freezing of the conflict in Donbass. Right? We've already seen Moscow seek to establish fuller control of the players on the ground. We saw this sort of odd kind of coup in Lugansk. It allows the Kremlin more effectively to manage violence in the region, reducing casualties along the line of control, stabilizing the humanitarian situation, might reduce the need for European policymakers in particular to maintain pressure on Russia. But Moscow, I think, will continue to consider the permanent resolution of the conflict, including, obviously, full restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty, as too high a price to pay even for the significant relaxation of sanctions. Normalization would cause political risks at home. Right? It would take away a conflict that's structurally important to domestic politics. Would also provoke, I think, the emergence of a disaffected nationalist constituency that would feel it's been abandoned by the Kremlin. But it would, more importantly, I think, result in the loss of leverage over Kiev. Right? And the idea that anybody could come to power, even a redux of somebody like Yanukovych, who would be outwardly friendly to the Kremlin, would deprive you, remove the need for Russia to have that leverage. I think is a mistake. If anything, Yanukovych was more difficult for the Kremlin to deal with than Yushchenko was. So this structural leverage over Ukraine is important. How am I doing on time, by the way? Before?
Okay, about 6 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, 10 minutes.
So, switching gears a little bit. Nick mentioned Trump at the outset, or what we can expect from the U.S. Surprises from Washington. I don't think we can expect any surprises from Washington on the Russia scene in the near future. Obviously, with accusations of corruption and collusion involving Moscow, it's impossible for the Trump administration to attempt any significant cooperative engagement with Russia. That, from some people's perspectives, may be a good thing, but given the violent clashes of American interests, Russian and American interests, both in Ukraine and Syria, the fact that there's no scope for engagement on strategic arms control, disposition and monitoring of conventional forces, or more general confidence-building measures, I think is a troubling thing to think about. The follow-on from that, though, is that Trump's eventual successor, whether that person comes to power through impeachment of the current president or in an election, so whether a Democrat or a Republican, Trump's successor is going to have very little room for maneuver. Capitol Hill and the American news media have both been drawn into a conversation about Russia that is increasingly untethered from deep factual analysis. I'll put it that way. As a result, it's very difficult to prioritize threats and to evaluate the effectiveness of responses. And there's little reason to believe, when you look at the American political scene now, that the discussion will revert to anything that feels more normal, simply because Trump eventually, mercifully, departs the White House. Europe's options, right, in this context are fairly limited, right? So the domestic logics that shape both Russian and American policy are not easily altered by external forces, cannot be brought up at the negotiating table. They are intrinsically domestic. But I think the limitations this places on European policymaking are in some ways advantageous, because they allow Europe to focus more narrowly and concentrate its resources on those fields where progress can be made, but also where the costs of failure are highest, right? And those may, in fact, be the same things. We've had conversation in Europe, obviously, about Russian intervention in electoral processes, referenda in this country, France, Germany, elsewhere. I'm not going to say anything about the quality of this evidence. I think that's something that can be investigated. But the European debate has not yet devolved into the kind of paralyzed and paralyzing discourse that the American debate has taken on. It's important, first and foremost, that Europe maintain that kind of level-headedness in its discussion on Russia, so that we can focus, policymakers can focus on the Russia-related threats and challenges that are tangible, rather than on those that are, at least for the moment, notional. And there are, of course, no shortage of tangible challenges. Right. First, obviously, Ukraine. Right. I think Europe can and should focus on two mutually reinforcing policy objectives. The first probably requires maintaining, if not increasing, the costs imposed by the Donbass conflict itself on Russia. Right? After 25 years of experience in Transnistria, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia, it's hard to have any illusions about Moscow's approach to conflict resolution in the post-Soviet space. Right? Maintenance of so-called frozen conflicts allows the Kremlin to impose a unilateral tax on governments in the region that choose to pursue domestic or international policy agendas that run counter to the ways that Russia perceives its own national interests. It creates insoluble problems of corruption and nationalist mobilization within countries that are beset by these conflicts, which in turn feed on trafficking and other aspects of conflict entrepreneurship. In the early 1990s, it might have seemed a reasonable solution to settle for a temporary cessation of hostilities and to purchase humanitarian improvements at the cost of what could have been thought of as a short-term reduction in sovereignty. In 2017, the cost-benefit analysis, I think, looks and feels very different, particularly for politicians in those capitals. Right? There is an opportunity for Europe to make the reduction of sanctions contingent not simply on the cessation of hostilities as prescribed in Minsk, but on the full restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty. And it's important to understand the ways that Donbass is not simply a tax on Ukrainian policymaking, but it's becoming, because of the cost of capital in Russia, an increasing tax on Russian policymaking. Second, Europe's Russian front clearly isn't limited to Ukraine. Right? The geopolitical and I think actually geoeconomic competition that drew Russia and Europe into war in Ukraine has the potential to extend across the eastern neighborhood. Russia remains opposed to the extension and approximation of European institutions, including of economic and competitive governance. And Moscow's acquiescence to the conclusion of deep and comprehensive free trade agreements in Moldova and Georgia does feel, at least to me, more tactical than strategic. Moscow may be calculating, of course, that these DCFTAs will contribute to their own demise, right? Because, as was the case with the relationships in Central and Eastern Europe and the association agreements there, they front-load the pain of reform for partner governments, and they backload the economic gain. Right? So again, there's an opportunity for the European Commission to look at the structure of these agreements with Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova to make adjustments that would allow earlier access to EU export markets for the signatories, bringing more material benefit to both governments and societies in the region. In the interest of time, I'll skip over some other things. I think there is work to be done on governance within Europe itself. There's a conversation obviously to be had about energy, but for the time being, Ukraine and the eastern neighborhood are probably enough to work on. I'll close with one thought. As long as the United States remains the backbone of NATO, obviously, and thus of European security to an extent, it's hard to envision lasting strategic progress on the Russian front without American involvement. Right? In an era in which that involvement is unlikely and perhaps even undesirable, given idiosyncratic foreign policy decisions coming out of the White House in recent weeks, Europe has an opportunity and potentially a responsibility to lay the foundations for Washington's eventual return to constructive engagement with international relations broadly and with Russia in particular. First and foremost, this means opening up meaningful track 2 dialogue on strategic arms control, on conventional forces, and confidence building in the European theater, perhaps more broadly. It is, I think we need to be clear that reaching an understanding with Russia at this stage is likely to prove impossible. But there is work that can be done on reaching comprehension, right, of Russia's interests, capabilities, and intentions. And that is probably something that's not just possible. I think it's something that's imperative. And I'll close with that.
Okay. Thank you very much. Let me start with questioning. So, first, thanks for getting us back into the mind of 2007. I remember all that reading of the tea leaves. Is this Ivanov? Is this Medvedev? Where's Sechin in the mix? Which was fabulous. You talked about the fact that you felt this idea of the United States in particular as an enemy was now intrinsic to the model. But how is that then played together with sanctions relief? How does one continue to reap the political benefits of a Cold War of sorts, while at the same time even state television could not elide past the fact that sanctions had been significantly reduced?
Well, I think that's a challenge. I don't think the Kremlin has an answer to that. And I think, to a certain extent, Russia looks at Minsk and says this is not implementable. Right? Says that in reality the sanctions, while they are justified by Minsk, don't seem to be directly linked to Minsk. Right? And thus, I think the Kremlin has come to the conclusion that there's very little, if anything, they could do that would actually get them out from under formal sanctions. Right? That this has already taken on a political logic in Berlin, in Washington, and elsewhere. And of course, it is Washington, particularly on the financial side, that matters. Right? Europe could lift most of its sanctions as long as the Treasury in the U.S. is going to enforce U.S. sanctions. It becomes impossible for any significant European financial institution to engage in transactions of any scale with Russia. Right. So in that context, I think the idea of pressing not on the sanctions themselves, but on sanctions enforcement, right, begins to look like a more attractive option, right? It's something that, in fact, the Trump administration could move on without rising to the level of congressional oversight, right? Because there is both formal guidance at this point under the new sanctions rules that have come in this year would raise would end up on congressional radar screens if John McCain is paying attention. But there is informal guidance that is provided by Treasury to compliance departments, to Wall Street. It filters its way, obviously, over to this side of the Atlantic as well. And that's something that they could move on, and that I think Moscow would very clearly like them to move on. The quid pro quo that would have to underpin that, I think, is not clear to either side, and partly because I think neither side can figure out how to have a conversation in a way that doesn't make everything worse for the Trump administration. But that kind of solution would to a certain extent allow Moscow to square the circle. Right? So they could say, look, they're still maintaining all of this sanctions pressure. You've still got increasing numbers of Russian elites on these lists. Now the media is full of these reports that there could be as many as 50 new high-profile Russians ending up on sanctions lists as of February or March. Right? So you can still maintain the political benefit even if you begin to pick apart at the technical infrastructure of sanctions enforcement.
Okay, thank you. Happy to open it up now. If you'd like to ask a question, catch my eye. The first one who did was Oksana.
Thank you, Sam. Really excellent presentation. Maybe 2 points where slightly I guess differ from you in your assessment. One thing that you said that there is the need to reaffirm legitimacy, and not only at the election time. I totally agree with that. But then the question is, what is legitimacy of the regime really means in the current environment? Is it still about rallying around the flag in the Crimea effect? Or if that is no longer sufficient to maintain the legitimacy of the regime, particularly at the time of the succession debate, would it not be then the whole issue of falling incomes, the deteriorating social infrastructure, and the economic challenges? And we just had, I think, the other day, really interesting report coming out, which said that maybe next year the economy will once again grind to a halt and will be again zero growth. And then with any fluctuation in oil prices could go back to the recession quite easily. So if Putin then, in your view, cannot do any structural reforms because it can undermine the political system, does it not mean that if he actually does not do any structural reforms, it will undermine legitimacy of the political system much faster, and then we arrive a few years down the road, particularly if the economy goes back into recession, we again have a couple of years of more rapidly falling real incomes, that the regime will be under a lot of pressure. And if you agree with this assessment, then what do you think are kind of reforms that are likely to take priority if indeed that sort of conclusions are going to be reached? And here, we're going to the issue of the role of Europe. If I understood you correctly from your presentation, you think that the only role that Europe can play relates to the conflict in Ukraine. I mean, I think the alternative view here could be that Europe tried to deal with the conflict in Ukraine now for a few years and has not really had much of a success. And I think maybe now increasingly the eyes are going towards Washington and what role they can play at some point to kind of weigh into this conflict. But Europe does have a role to play in terms of both encouraging and a return to certain approximation economically, technically, trade-wise between Europe and Russia, some sort of measures to support the middle class, some sort of ideas on returning back to the kind of various aspects of partnership for modernization. Is that something you think can coexist with the sanctions regime, or is it something which is completely off the table?
Okay. Easy questions. But really, I really like, in particular, the first question, partly because I've got a book manuscript due in May on the subject. So, legitimacy obviously is a slippery slope, and is a particularly slippery slope for Putin, right? So the meaning of legitimacy for him changed very dramatically, beginning after the protests 2011-2012. Right? He begins to understand he's got an opposition that's real and it's not going anywhere that he has to do something about. He sort of stumbles across ideology as a way of doing that. Crimea then helps, right? But what Crimea really fundamentally does is allows the perceptions of Putin, right, to be divorced from the perceptions of everything else, right? So if you look at support for United Russia, if you look at support for Medvedev's government, you look at support for local, regional governance, it's at sort of Theresa May levels. But Putin remains above that, right? And what we've been seeing in sort of the sociological research that at least I've been involved with suggests that he's been able to create, again, I think largely accidentally, right? But he's happy about it. An emotional relationship. It sounds odd, but in reality, it's that sort of intangible, symbolic relationship, right? That has thus far allowed him to remain popular, even as everybody understands that the country is not well governed. Right? I don't know how long that will last. He doesn't know how long that will last. I think there's a conservative streak in his sort of political strategy and that around him that you would not want to do anything that would make it last less long than it otherwise might. Right? So you certainly don't want to risk undermining any of the senses of threat on one side, but also sort of community that this has created on the other side of membership of this now resurgent political community that has made that possible, right? But I think they are broadly aware that at some point there is the potential for the fact that Russians are evidently, as best we can tell from the statistics, borrowing more in order to spend less, right? That is eventually going to have political consequences, and those political consequences will eventually filter their way up the system. I think Putin is interested, probably actually, in structural reform for a couple of reasons. A, to solve that problem, right? But also because he is fundamentally interested in sovereignty, right? And he understands that sovereignty without fiscal sovereignty doesn't exist, right? So the last place he wants to be is in hoc to the IMF and Western financial institutions. I think there is a scenario in which he takes himself out of the presidency early, right? So he gets himself reelected, right? But then retreats into a position where he continues to be an arbiter, but he can unblock the policy process by handing over the presidency to somebody else. A redux, essentially, of Medvedev, but with somebody maybe slightly more inspiring in the formal role, right? Who would then be empowered to take some risks, right? Which then raises the question of your question of what would those risks look like, and I think it does come down to two things, right? One of which is, again, fiscal sovereignty, right? So making sure that the government is responsible in the way that it spends money. Right? I have a hard time seeing a Venezuelan turn in Russian politics. I think that they in fact see the Venezuelan experience, but they remember the Russian experience of the 90s. They do not want to go down that road. I think the other thing that you would see is a reduction in transaction costs. Right. So there is an understanding that even if the sorts of rents for the academically minded people in the room, there's a good book by Stan Marcus now at the University of South Carolina on what he calls agent predation, right? So on rent seeking by people further down in the hierarchy, right? The amount of friction that the current regulation of the economy creates, right, is a source of rents for all of these people, right? That does not mean that it's something that the very top of the system is happy about. That's essentially a transaction cost on Putin's and the top elites' ability to run the country, right? And so I think they would, if they could find a way, be very happy to reduce some of those transaction costs, as long as they were sure that they wouldn't create a backlash among the bureaucracy that would then make it difficult for them to run the country. They've been gradually doing that in sector after sector. So you have the introduction of electronic governance, which means you can now do lots of things without ever seeing a bureaucrat. Nothing makes a Russian citizen happier than that. I've lived 14 years in Moscow. Nothing makes me happier than that, right? But you might see more of those sorts of things. The role for Europe, I think, is on the governance side, right? The initial idea, right, that we all thought, in the early 90s, Russia's going to become just like us, whatever that means, right? Because you create a capital holding class, right? That capital holding class then generates demand for rule of law, right? And you begin to get good governance within the country, right? What we've actually seen is that that's true, but we forgot about borders, right? So you did get a capital holding class who does want a safe place to not only, but it wants a safe place to keep their money, right? But they find that safe place here. And they find that safe place in the U.S. and in Europe, right? So the result of that is a reduction in the demand for rule of law in Russia, right? You will always earn more money with higher margins in low rule of law environments than you will in high rule of law environments, right? So what we've done is we've given the economic elite, who are inseparable from the political elite, the ability to have the best of both worlds. Right. There is a job of work to be done in the West that looks at the availability of rule of law institutions here for people who would not have been able to earn their money here. Right. The ways that we tend to at least aspire to govern our markets. I won't say that things are perfect, right? And there's good domestic reasons to do that, right? The amount of we've seen the reports coming just from around the corner, right, about the fact that the amount of litigation that gets done, not just by Russian oligarchs, but by oligarchs from low rule of law environments around the world, right, prices English litigants out of English courts, right? It's distorting for the property market, and all of us living in London know that, right? So there are good reasons to pursue this aside from the effects that it might have on Russia, right? If you were to force the Russian capital owning class, right, to seek rule of law solutions in their own jurisdiction.
Right. There's a gentleman at the back.
Hi, I'm Sean from Chinese Embassy. I wish to ask a question about the relations between Britain and Russia, because Boris originally he plans to go to Moscow for a visit earlier this year, but was delayed due to the U.S. maybe the visit by Mr. Tillerson. But he seems to be making another trip later this month. So what kind of expectations do you think he can achieve through these kind of visits?
Another question for which I don't really have the answer. Look, I think this government deserves actually quite a bit of credit, right, for keeping some kind of relationship going at the sub-political level, right? So we've seen a decision recently by the Foreign Office to spend quite a bit of money on cultural diplomacy, right? And that is meaningful. Right? It's meaningful for a number of reasons, not just because there's intrinsic value in culture, but it does actually become a little bit harder to push the West is just Russophobic argument when you've got a train going back and forth on the Hammersmith and City line that's plastered with Russian culture, right? When you had the year of literature last year, we have you had the year of culture last year. We have years of literature and music coming up, as far as I understand. A lot of money's been given to the British Council for this sort of thing. Whether that's a foundation that can actually be built on for something more intrinsically foreign policy related in terms of the security relationship or the economic relationship, I think it's very hard to see, right? And I think this government will continue to suffer from the problems, frankly, that have beset a number of governments here in the relationship with Russia, which is a lack of a Russia policy, frankly, right? There hasn't been, I think, a sense of there's a Ukraine policy, there's a Russia trade policy, there's a Russia culture policy, there's sometimes a security policy, right? But there isn't a sense of, well, what would the UK like the relationship with Russia to look like in the future? This is not indistinct, in fact, from something that Oksana raised about the European policy, right? So the sorts of technical partnerships, technical assistance, approximation, those partnerships have been on the table with Russia for a very, very long time. But Europe and the UK have always been content to let demand from Moscow drive the success of those partnerships, right? And rather than creating the incentives, maybe both positive and negative incentives, to actually show that, no, we would like you really to engage with this, right? That this is important to us, and that there are tangible benefits to the relationship that come along with it. I think, given all of the other problems that this government has to solve right now, it's hard to imagine really a cabinet level consensus about Russia that would allow for a concerted policy, right? So I think it's good symbolically that Boris Johnson is going, but I would not have a lot of expectations for what would come out of that.
Okay, please.
It's Masato Kimura, Japanese journalist. My question is about the price of oil and gas and China and the longevity of Putin leadership. And so Chinese President Xi Jinping could go to next 10 years. I think so. Putin think he must stay as long as Xi Jinping stay. And also Chinese economy get back on track. And so we could expect the consumption of oil and gas is coming back. And so it means that the price of oil and gas could be increasing, and so it supports Putin, I think. How do you evaluate what percentage we could see the post or Putin era after 2024?
I have a follow-up to that.
Okay.
What happens if China withholds its investments and there are fewer revenues from oil and gas sales to China and fewer alternatives available? Would it upset the calculus for the administration on the economic side, 2018 to 2024?
Another easy question.
Again, really, really good questions. I'm not going to get into the business of predicting the oil price. China obviously is a factor in that, but it's only one factor. What we have seen clearly, though, is that China does not want to become dependent on Russian hydrocarbons, right? So it wants Russia in the mix, right? But only in the mix. And so it's not going to be interested in the kind of strategic relationship that would give Russia the certainty in terms of large-scale, long-term, guaranteed energy income, right? That Russia used to rely on Europe for, right? And I think Moscow is fairly hard-nosed about this, right? Is clear about this, and this, to a certain extent, is an answer to the second question. There was maybe more hope, and I think it was a hope born out of surprise and necessity, right? That Russia was, to a certain extent, caught by surprise by the longevity of European sanctions and the depth of consensus between Washington and Berlin in particular on that. That led to a lot of hope, or at least rhetorical hope, on the relationship with Russia. But I think with China. But I think they very quickly came to realize that structurally China can't replace Europe in terms of both capital inflows and in terms of income. I mean, obviously, regardless of Russia's relationship with Europe, right? If you've got the geopolitical and geographical position simply that Russia has, right? You want to be trading robustly with Europe and with China, right? But to make the adjustments, to change the cost structure of Russian capital markets, to accept the price points that are currently acceptable to China on hydrocarbon trade, to invest on those terms, right? Comes at a significant cost for the Russian government. They understand that, I think, and thus are not placing too many eggs in that basket. So I don't think they will have built their strategy up to 2024 on very strong assumptions about income from China, right? At the same time, clearly, it's an important relationship. There was something that the Chinese Foreign Ministry put out the other day, mentioning sort of offhandedly that they thought it was wonderful that Putin and Xi had something like 23 conversations in the last year and a half or so. Right? So clearly, it's an important relationship. Clearly, it's a relationship that Russia diplomatically wants to get right. But Putin has generally given the technocrats in the economic bloc of the government the free rein to count the numbers as they are, rather than as he would politically want them to be. And I think that they will be giving him pretty sound advice on most of this stuff.
Okay, Richard, please.
Thank you very much, Richard Bridge from the BP. You spoke very interestingly about how when Putin's in his fourth term, he's going to kind of send signals to kind of keep factions balanced and preserve that role of arbiter. But I just wanted to ask you if it's worthwhile thinking now about what kind of aims and objectives and priorities Putin will have during that fourth term, in terms of what he wants for himself, in terms of security. Will he want ultimate retirement, or would he want to go into some kind of Deng Xiaoping type model? What kind of legacy would he want in terms of ideas or policies or styles? And I also wondered if it's worth now thinking about what do you think he will want to do with members of his team, his close associates. Will he be looking for, safe exit for them? Will he perhaps more consciously be looking to retire them to bring in a new generation who can then take over in 2024? I mean, these are all speculative things, but I just wondered if you...
Well, so the second part of the question is a bit easier, right? Because we have some data points we can build on, right? So we have seen a gradual move of changing of the guard, right? Some of this, I think I would be resistant to any argument that said there's one reason why all of these changes, going from Yakunin to Ivanov to governors in various places. I think that it's always more complex than that, right? But I think that there are a number of things going on. People are getting older, right, and have a right to want to retire, and in fact that would be my explanation of Ivanov's departure. Right, I think that he had enough. Gets to stay on in some role where he has some access and can be in the room for conversations, but he doesn't have the kind of responsibility. In other cases, like Yakunin, but also some of the governors, I think it's a transaction cost thing. A lot of these people who've been around for a long time, they develop their own patronage networks, right? They have access to rent flows, but they divert some of those rent flows to feed those patronage networks, right? In a situation of tight liquidity, when you're trying to make sure that you don't dissipate the rents in the system, you're afraid of a bank run kind of situation, right? So you need to make sure that you've got a bit of a steadier hand and a less beholden hand, right? Running something like Russian railways or resource-rich regions that are large generators of rent flow. So I think that explains some of the move of technocrats into those positions. And I would expect to see more of the same on both of those fronts moving forward. Certainly anybody, though, who also looks like they are positioning themselves to be too safe after 2024, right, would probably come in for some increased attention, right, in terms of their role. I think, though, there is Putin's been maintaining some ambiguity in terms of how he deals with the elite, right, which is that there used to be fairly clear, if unwritten, rules of the game, right? Any asset you have in the system is held under leasehold, right? You can extract from it what you will while you have it, but when the state comes calling, right, to give it to somebody else to keep the system balanced, you give it up, right? If you try to hold on to it, you're done in a very real sense, right? And that held for a very long time, right? So people who resisted left and didn't come back. People who didn't resist, so you take somebody like Serdyukov, gets pushed out of the defense ministry, finds himself back in the system, and that's always been the quid pro quo. If you play by the rules, you'll be taken care of. Then you see something like Ulyukayev, right? For as best we can tell, if he broke any rules, we don't know what rules he broke, right? Even somebody like Yevtushenko, right, who gives up Bashneft when they come calling for it, but he's constantly under more and more pressure, right? So there's pressure on those rules of the game, and Putin has to decide, I think, whether he's going to keep that bargain in place for the elite, or whether he's going to start creating more permanent winners and losers. And I think that would be the clue that we need to think about what he does next. Right? If he does create more permanent winners and losers, I think it becomes a bit harder for him for us to see him backing out of the system. Right? But I think we'll have to wait and see. The answer to that question requires getting inside his head, which not something I do.
Yes, please.
Matt Simon, trustee of the Institute. Mm-hmm. If Robert Mueller were to establish collusion between the Trump campaign and Moscow, independent of what happened to the president, what further actions would you expect to see the United States taking, and how would it affect what you refer to as the level-headedness of the Europeans?
It's hard to see. Let's put it this way: there will have to be a political response, right? So, assuming that Trump is let me put it this way: there's two ways that the collusion argument can go. Right? You can look at it from the perspective of what is it that Russia was trying to buy, right? But the flip side of that, what is it that the Trump administration was trying to sell, or the Trump organization was prepared to sell, right? From a U.S. legal perspective, right, the second question is more important, right? So, and I think in terms of Trump's political future, the second question is more important, right? But if the discussion around that really does emphasize this as not something that was initiated by Trump, right, coming to Moscow with something to sell, but that it was in fact Russia almost creating this out of whole cloth, right? Then I think it becomes very difficult for Capitol Hill not to respond with something further, right? It's hard to imagine exactly what that would be. There's not a whole lot left to undo, and hopefully somebody in the Pentagon would say, look, we need to at some point get back to the conversations about strategic arms control and just transparency on the defense scene, right? So, and even people like the Russia hawks on Capitol Hill, McCain and Graham, understand that, right? So, I think it's likely to be symbolic, right? If there's a response, it will hopefully simply be enough to get Trump out of the picture. But we'll have to see how many other people, and the collusion argument can also take down Pence at this stage, right? So end up with President Paul Ryan, and life looks interesting. But then the Russia story, to a certain extent, goes away, right? Because he's not linked to any of that. The impact that it has on Europe. Again, I think it probably increases the volume of the conversations here about Russian involvement in elections. But that is a fundamentally different conversation, right? Because it's not clear outside of, say, a couple of people who recently launched television programs on Russia Today. It's not clear that there were any significant political forces that were trying to sell something to Russia, right? And so the collusion from the supply side, right, doesn't seem to be in the conversation to the same degree, so maybe Europe doesn't get pushed into the same kind of political spiral that the U.S. has. But these things take on a life of their own, as we've seen here. So.
Okay, and that answer is legally privileged. Yes,
Peter Conradi from Sunday Times. The point you made earlier about Putin perhaps during this next term could step aside, sort of in connection with sort of allowing someone else to implement radical economic reforms. I mean, is there, what kind of basis do you have for thinking that he might do that? Because it would seem quite an extraordinary step. And I suppose the second question is, and you mentioned in the context of British policy that Britain hasn't really decided what it would like its relation with Russia to look like. Have any other European countries really decided that? Has the EU decided that? Has America decided that? Ever?
Not for a very long time, right? So on the first question. No, I mean, I haven't seen any signals that that's something he would like to do. That is entirely an idea based on sort of trying to come up with ways in which the current power structure could unblock structural reform, right? And I think that would require getting rid of the constitutional question around 2024, right? And the only way you do that is by getting rid of the person who is limited by the Constitution, right? So if you can take the power structure outside of pure constitutionality, right, which is only about half a step from where they are at the moment anyway, then it becomes easier to imagine, right, reform going ahead. But I think the cost of no reform would have to begin to look catastrophically high for that to begin to look like a risk worth taking. There's a reason that Putin came back and didn't extend the tandem with Medvedev for another term. Right? He evidently felt that situation to be untenable, right? And not simply because Medvedev clearly was inspiring to some group of people, and he had a constituency around him. And if Putin hadn't come back, you wouldn't have had the protests of 2011, 2012, right? The world would look very different. But that was something he felt he needed to do, right? Which does suggest that things would have to be very, very bad indeed for him to decide that it was time for him to step even into a powerful role, right? But one that would be less than constitutionally presidential. On the second question, it's a short answer. No, I don't think that any of the policy communities in the West have had a clear sense of what they would like the relationship with Russia to look like. The reality is that the relationship with Russia has, since the end of the Soviet Union, been one of what was assumed to be benign neglect, and has turned into something maybe slightly less benign, but has certainly been neglectful. Right? There was a very easy assumption that Russia would move in our direction because there was no other direction in which to move. Even as we look at places where there was a much more transformational relationship from the European side in particular, in places like Hungary, Poland, where we've seen, we continue to see, right, how incomplete those transformations are. Right? So is it any surprise that we see what we see in Russia, given that there wasn't even that level of engagement. I'm not saying that we could have imagined what that would look like. I think at some point John Major said that he could imagine Russia joining the European Union up to the Urals, right? That's not a policy, right? That's not a feasible policy idea. What do you do with the rest of Russia? Right?
The same as the Northern Ireland and perhaps Britain.
Well,
so disappointed, frustrated, and mildly anxious neglect. Last two questions. I'm very sorry. I'm going to have to disappoint a couple of people, but if we can have first Mary Krzyzewski and then you, please.
Mary Krzyzewski, I just wondered whether you shared my slight surprise at the equanimity in Moscow about everything that's going on in Washington, and whether you do or not, how you explain it.
Very briefly on David Craig, British Airways, very briefly on Syria. Why did Russia get involved in Syria? How will Russia extract itself from Syria? And how does Russia balance its ambitions in the Sunni world with its alliance with Shia Iran?
I will answer the second question first by not answering it, because I'm not a foreign policy person. I'm really fundamentally Russian domestic politics person. As you will have noticed, my explanations of Russian foreign policy all start with domestic politics. I don't see a great domestic political reason for having gone into Syria, right? So I can leave it at that. There are people who know a lot more about that than I do, and I would let them answer that question. On equanimity vis-a-vis Washington, I think to a certain extent it's sort of it's bemused sort of bewilderment more than anything else. I think that in the wildest dreams of Dmitry Kiselyov and that team, right, they could not have imagined what has happened to American politics, right? And so they don't have to say anything, right? They can simply let people see what's going on, right? It proves the point without having to narrate it, right? And then you wait and see what happens, right? Because if anything, American politics at this point are much less predictable than Russian politics. So I think Moscow probably feels that it can wait, it can see how this turns out, and it will be able to come up with a manageable response, right, to whatever comes out of Washington. Almost, as long as it's not war with North Korea or something like that.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's bring things to a close, but Sam will perhaps be around for a few more minutes to have a chat. But thank you very much, and please join me in thanking him.